You turned back into the stable's dimness, where the air smelled of hay dust and horse and the cool mineral scent of stone that never dried. The chestnut mare stood in her stall, with her weight shifted off her right foreleg, the hoof tip just enough to keep the soreness from pressing into the straw. She was a solid, short-backed horse with a coat the color of polished oak, and her dark eye followed you without alarm as you slid the stall door open and murmured something low and meaningless. A string of soft sounds meant only to let her know that nothing had changed. You had been watching this leg since yesterday evening, when she had come back from a short pull, with a slight heat above the fetlock, and a carefulness in her step that told you what you needed to know. The innkeeper had looked at her, laid a hand on the swelling, and said the old words, "Walk her slow, keep her moving, just enough that the leg does not stiffen, let the cold do its work." So you had been given this single duty, and nothing else was asked of you. You slipped the halter over her head, settling the noseband across the broad, flat bone of her face, and she accepted it the way an old mare does, with a slight lowering of her head and a slow blink. Her breath came out in 2 plumes of steam that curled upward and vanished into the rafters. You led her out of the stall through the wide central aisle of the stable where 2 other horses stood dozing, a grey gelding and a younger bay, neither of them stirring as you passed except for a twitch of an ear. The floor of the aisle was laid with cobbles that had been polished smooth by a century of hooves, and your own shoes made a soft, scraping sound that the mare's unshod hind feet echoed with a duller note. You stopped just inside the stable door to tighten the wool muffler around your throat, tucking the ends into the collar of your coat, and you felt the first real bite of the cold settle through the seams of your clothing. The cold was not yet bitter, but it was a damp, patient cold that came from the east and found every gap in wool and linen. When you stepped out into the yard, the mare followed with her head low, and her right foreleg came down with a tiny hesitation, the hoof kissing the ground a fraction later than it should, the faintest nod in her stride that anyone else might have missed. You felt it through the halter rope, a slight change in the rhythm of her movement that you'd already learned to read as a language of its own. The snow was still falling with that same unhurried gentleness, the flakes growing slightly thicker now, so that they showed against the dark stone of the inn's main building and the grey-brown thatch as tiny points of moving white. A few settled on the mare's back and melted at once, darkening her coat in small patches, and you brushed the gathering flakes from your sleeve with a slow movement of your free hand. The yard measured perhaps 40 paces along its longest side from the stable doors to the archway, and perhaps 30 paces across, so that walking its full perimeter meant a circuit of 120 comfortable steps, give or take. You had walked this same line many times before, when a horse needed cooling after a hard run, or when a nervous animal had to be settled in a strange place, but never with such a long and empty stretch of hours ahead. You chose a starting point near the lantern post that stood in the center of the yard, a tall iron standard with a crossbar and a horn-paned lantern that was not lit at this hour, and you began to walk a wide clockwise circle that kept you close to the walls, where the footing was most even. The mare fell into step beside you with the patience of an animal that understood the bargain. You would go nowhere in particular, and she would keep moving without hurry. The sound of her hooves was a 3-part beat with a pause where the 4th beat should have been, a soft, staggered rhythm that your own feet unconsciously matched. The first circuit was a passage of pure observation. You noted the way the cobbles near the kitchen door were darker and smoother, worn down by the constant traffic of servants carrying buckets and trays, and how a crack in the wall near the woodpile had been stuffed with moss to keep the wind out. You noticed the snow beginning to collect in the crevices between the stones, white lines slowly outlining the shape of each cobble, and the way the thatch over the stable block held a faint green tinge of old moss under its blanket of frost. Your breath hung in the air for a moment before the wind, which was little more than a slow drift of air from the north, pulled it apart into nothing. By the 3rd circuit you no longer needed to think about the path. Your feet knew where to turn at the corner by the mounting block, how to angle slightly outward to avoid the patch of broken stone near the rain barrel, when to pause to let the mare shift her weight and rest her bad leg for the space of 5 slow breaths. The snow was falling steadily now, not thick enough to blind but constant, and the flakes made a soft hissing sound as they met the packed earth, a sound so faint that it existed at the very edge of hearing. The mare's lame footfall produced a double scrape over the ground, a shush click shush-click that became as steady as a clock in a distant room. Her head hung low, her ears flopping gently with each step, and the warmth of her body radiated through the halter rope and into your gloved hand. You watched the grey sky lower and thicken until you could no longer tell where the sun might be, the light fading so gradually that the change was like watching an hour hand move. The inn's windows began to show the first glimmer of candlelight behind their oiled paper panes, faint orange squares that reflected in the wet cobbles and made the snow look blue by contrast. A boy came out of the kitchen with a bucket of ashes and saw you walking, and for a moment he stood still, his breath steaming, before he tipped the ashes onto the midden heap and hurried back inside without a word. You heard the kitchen door close with a soft thump, and then the yard was yours again. The cold deepened as you walked, a creeping, gradual deepening that moved through your shoes first, the leather soaking up the chill of the stone until your toes felt distant and padded. You flexed your fingers inside your gloves and switched the halter rope from your right hand to your left, then back again, just for the slight change of sensation. The mare's ears turned toward you each time you moved, checking, then swung forward again to face the falling snow. Her coat had grown damp and dark along her spine, and the snowflakes that landed on her mane stayed there for a few seconds before melting, each one a tiny starburst of white against the coarse hair. Halfway through the 7th or 8th circuit, you stopped by the trough to let her rest, and she blew softly through her nostrils, ruffling the thin ice skin with her breath. You looked up at the sky and saw nothing but a uniform field of grey, unbroken by any variation, and you thought of the road beyond the archway, empty all the way from London to York, under the same steady snow. The inn sign creaked again, and the sound was like an old door opening in an empty house, a sound that belonged to the quiet rather than breaking it. You counted the creaks as you resumed walking, and they came at long, irregular intervals, maybe 15 or 20 paces apart, maybe more. The light now was that peculiar twilight of a snowstorm, when the snow itself seems to glow faintly from within, as if it were both falling and radiating a soft white luminosity. You could still make out the shapes of the buildings and the line of the wall, but the details were blurring, the edges softening as the snow began to settle in earnest. The track you were wearing into the ground was a dark line on the grey cobbles, a single unbroken ring that grew more visible with each circuit, like a drawing being traced over and over. The mare's hoof prints showed the irregular spacing, the right forefoot leaving a lighter mark than the left, a testament to her care for the sore leg. You felt yourself sinking into a state of calm repetition, your mind no longer reaching for anything beyond the circle and the horse and the snow. The world outside the yard had grown so quiet that you could hear the individual sounds of the inn's interior, a distant murmur of voices from the taproom, the thump of a wooden mug on a table, the scrape of a bench on flagstones, all of it muffled by the walls and the falling snow as if wrapped in wool. The mare's hooves and your own feet made the only nearby sounds, and these too were muffled, absorbed by the thickening layer of soft white that was beginning to cling to the stones. The snow kept falling, and the circle kept turning. Your mind began to wander in the way that comes with rhythmic walking, not to any particular memory or thought, but to a kind of peaceful blankness, a suspension of ordinary time. You noticed, without really noticing, that the snowflakes were no longer melting on the stones but staying whole, a thin white gauze spreading across the yard. The lantern post wore a small cap of white, and the rim of the water trough had grown a soft white lip. The mare's lame step had become so familiar that you could no longer imagine her moving any other way. The tiny head nod and the whisper of the dragging hoof were the natural music of this evening. Once, the innkeeper's dog, an old black and tan terrier, came out of the kitchen door and stood with his nose lifted to the snow, sniffing the air in short, sharp inhalations. He watched you pass without interest, then turned 3 times on the doorstep and settled into a tight curl, his muzzle tucked under his tail, and in a few minutes he was mantled in the dusting of white. You passed him on every circuit, and each time his eyes were closed, his sides rising and falling with a sleep so deep that he seemed part of the stone itself. The mare's leg had not worsened, you noted, as you paused again to check the swelling with a gentle hand laid just above the fetlock. The heat was still there, a faint warmth under the skin that you could feel even through your glove, but it was no greater than before, and the mare allowed the touch without flinching. You patted her shoulder, and she turned her head to nuzzle your sleeve, her whiskers brushing the wet wool, before you began walking again along the same unchanging route. Time passed in a way that was not measured. You had no watch, and the church clock in the village a mile away was too far to hear even on a still day, let alone through a snowfall. The only markers were the gradual deepening of the white on the ground, and the slow, almost imperceptible darkening of the sky from grey to a deeper grey, then to a grey that held the first hint of night. The windows of the inn became brighter and more golden, and you saw the shapes of people moving behind the oiled paper, shadows that elongated and shrank without meaning. A woman's voice called something indistinct, and a door opened and closed, and then the snow kept falling with the same quiet steadiness, indifferent to the hour. You found that your breathing had slowed to match the mare's, your exhales timing themselves to the shush click of her bad foot, and your body had warmed into the walk, so that the cold no longer felt like a threat, but like a condition of the world, a given thing as neutral as gravity. Your shoes were wet through now, but you walked on. The muffler around your neck had grown stiff with frozen breath, and you pulled it up over your chin, tucking it into place with the habit of a man who'd spent many winters out of doors. The snow piled softly on the thatch, on the stone lintels, on the top rail of the fence that separated the yard from the kitchen garden. Everything was being simplified, the details of the world erased one by one under a common whiteness. The mare's mane held a fine lattice of snowflakes that did not melt, and when she shook her head once, a small puff of white flew outward and dissolved. You stopped to brush the snow from your own shoulders and hat, a gesture as automatic as breathing, and then you walked on, the circle unbroken, the yard entirely quiet except for the steady shush-click and the endless gentle hiss of the snow. You took the halter rope in your right hand, feeling the twisted hemp against your glove, and you began the first slow circle of the day without ceremony, stepping away from the lantern post where you had been standing and moving toward the wall that ran along the stable block. The mare followed with her head low, and her right foreleg came down with that same slight drag, a soft scuff of horn on the packed earth that created a 3.5-beat rhythm, step, 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 scuff, a tiny silence, then step again. You walked along the wall where the cobbles were most level, passing the stable door that stood half open to the dim interior where the grey gelding and the bay horse still rested in their stalls, the warm smell of hay drifting out to mix with the cold snow-scented air. Your breath and the mare's breath rose together in separate plumes, hers larger and slower, a steady cloud that formed and dissipated with each exhale, marking time as clearly as a bell. You counted your paces without conscious intention, the numbers settling into your mind like stones dropping into still water. 1, 2, 3, 4, and on through the 20s and 30s, each count a soft mental marker that gave structure to the endless circuit. The mare's ears turned forward and back in a slow, absent rhythm, flicking at the small sounds of the inn, a door closing somewhere in the kitchen, the distant murmur of a voice that reached you only as a vibration in the cold air. You passed the rain barrel at the corner where the stable wall met the kitchen garden fence, and you noted the way the thin ice on the water surface had thickened since you first came out, now a white opaque skin that reflected nothing but the grey sky. The barrel's wooden staves were dark with old moisture, and a single long icicle had begun to form at the spigot, no thicker than a straw, but already sharp at the tip. Turning left at the first corner, you walked along the short wall that separated the yard from the kitchen garden, a wall of rough stone topped with flat coping stones that held a dusting of snow. Beyond it, the garden lay invisible under the growing white blanket, the leafless sticks of the herb bushes and the bare canes of the raspberry rose slowly losing their shapes. You continued counting, and the numbers rolled forward into the 50s, then the 60s, your mind latching onto them as a quiet occupation that asked nothing of you. The mare's weight shifted perceptibly with each stride, her heavy body tilting slightly away from the sore foreleg, so that her left shoulder took more of the load, and you could see the muscles in her neck working in a subdued ripple beneath the damp chestnut coat. At the second corner you turned again, now walking along the wall that faced the Great North Road, and here the snow fell with a slightly different angle, the wind having found a gap in the archway so that the flakes drove sideways in a slanting curtain that stung your cheek with a dry, cold touch. You dipped your head and felt the brim of your hat catch the snow, building a tiny ridge of white that you brushed away with your free hand. The mare blinked against the flakes, her long lashes beaded with moisture, and she lowered her head further so that her muzzle nearly touched the snow-dusted cobbles. The sound of her scuffing hoof changed here, becoming slightly louder on a patch of stone that was rougher and less warm, a section of the yard that had been relaid some years earlier, with new cobbles that still held their quarried edges. Your count reached 100 and you began again at 1 without breaking stride, the numbers so ingrained now that they cycled naturally like the turning of a wheel. The mare's lame step created a faint unevenness in the snow that was beginning to accumulate, her right forehoof leaving a shallower impression than the left, smearing the white into a thin smear rather than a clean print. You observed this with the detached attention of a man who had nothing else to do, the same way you noticed the snow building on the lantern post's iron finial, or the way the thatch on the stable roof was now entirely white and smooth as a swept floor. Passing the kitchen door, you smelled wood smoke and the faint, savory scent of a stew pot simmering, a smell that reminded you of warmth and made your stomach stir with a distant, manageable hunger. The door was closed, but a thin line of yellow light showed at its base, trembling slightly as someone moved inside. You continued walking, and the kitchen smells faded, replaced again by the clean, mineral cold of the snow and the warm, grassy scent of the mare beside you. Her nearness was a constant comfort, her bulk a solid presence that blocked the wind from your left side, and you found yourself matching not only her pace, but her very posture. A slight forward lean into the cold, a relaxed droop of the shoulders that conserved warmth. The circle you traced was not a perfect geometric shape, but an organic one, adjusted for the minor obstacles of the yard, a pile of firewood stacked against the inn wall, a shallow depression near the midden heap where rainwater collected in summer, the iron scraper for boots that stood by the mounting block. You eased around each of these without thought, your feet knowing the path so well that your conscious mind could drift elsewhere, to the memory of other snowfalls. Other horses walked in other yards long ago and far away. The mare's hoof scuffed on, and your count continued, 1 through 100, 1 through 100, a litany as soothing as the surf. At a certain point you stopped to let her rest, not because she was tired, but because the routine of stopping was itself part of the healing, a moment for the leg to cool and the blood to settle. You stood in the corner near the archway where the wind was least, and you faced the mare, running your gloved hand down the length of her foreleg from the shoulder to the fetlock, feeling the warmth of the swelling with the same careful touch a clockmaker might use on a delicate spring. The heat was steady but not increased, a small, contained fire under the skin that spoke of healing rather than worsening. The mare leaned her head against your shoulder for a long moment, her heavy jaw pressing into the wool of your coat, and her sigh was a deep, shuddering exhalation that ruffled the snow at your feet. You waited until her breathing had settled into a slower rhythm, and then you clicked your tongue softly and began walking again. The snow deepened as the afternoon wore on, and the track you were making became more pronounced, a dark path in the growing white that was bordered by the untouched snow on either side. When you turned the corner by the stable, you saw your own footprints from earlier circuits already filling with fresh flakes, the sharp edges of the heel marks softening and blurring toward oblivion. The mare's prints did the same, the distinct 3 1/2 beat pattern slowly erasing itself as the snowfall continued its patient work of erasure. The world was being made smooth and blank, and you were the only agents of disturbance, and even your disturbance was fleeting. Your counting branched out now into a way of measuring not just distance but time. You knew that a full circuit took between 110 and 120 paces depending on how closely you hugged the walls, and you knew that each pace was roughly the span of a second and a half of easy walking, so that a circuit consumed something like 3 minutes of ordinary time. You did not perform the multiplication, you simply held the sense that the afternoon was composed of circuits stacked end to end like flat stones, each one identical to the last, each one bringing the mare's leg a little closer to soundness, and the sun a little closer to sounding, though the sun was invisible, and the light was merely a slow dimming from grey to deeper grey. The inn sign creaked again, a sound you now anticipated and received with a kind of gratitude, as if it were a friend signalling from a distance. The creak came and went, and in its absence, the quiet was so complete that you heard the tiny creak, creak, creak of a frozen twig tapping against the kitchen garden wall, moved by a breeze so slight you could not feel it on your face. You passed the dog still curled on the doorstep, his black and tartan coat now entirely white, except for the tip of his nose which twitched as he dreamed. The snow on his back had accumulated to a depth of about an inch, a perfect miniature blanket that rose and fell with his breathing. The mare's pace never varied, that steady, compromised walk that she had settled into as if it were her natural gait, and you admired the way an animal could accept a limitation and simply incorporate it, making no complaint, offering no resistance. Her right forehoof continued its soft drag over the cobbles, a sound that had become as much a part of the yard's acoustics as the wind or the distant kitchen noises. You found that you could listen to it for long stretches without actually hearing it, the way you could look at a familiar face without truly seeing it, the perception turning inward to a state of restful suspension. The cold had moved deeper into your body now, past the wet leather of your shoes and into the bones of your feet, and up through the weave of your coat to settle in your shoulder blades and the small of your back. You accepted this too. You knew the cold as an old companion, something to be endured rather than fought. You flexed your toes inside your shoes with each step, a small movement that kept the blood moving, and you pulled your muffler higher so that the warm air of your exhalations pooled around your chin before escaping into the snow. The mare's warmth radiated through the rope and into your glove, a small handhold of heat in the general chill. The circuit repeated. You lost count of the number of circuits, holding only to the count of paces within each one, those reliable numbers that reset themselves again and again. The day had become a single long moment, a continuous present in which nothing changed except the slow accumulation of snow on every horizontal surface. The thatch on the stable roof now overhung the eaves in a thick white lip, and the lantern post wore a collar of snow at its base. The track you walked was dark and clear, a ring of wet stone in a field of white, and you followed it as a mule follows a well-worn trail, without thought, without effort. The mare's head hung lower now, and her breathing had deepened into a steady, rhythmic bellows that matched the slow cadence of her walk. She was not tired. She was settled, the way a horse settles into a long journey, finding the economy of movement that would carry her forward without strain. Her bad leg still came down with that same careful hesitation, but you thought, or perhaps imagined, that the hesitation was a fraction less pronounced than it had been an hour ago, a subtle easing that might have been real, or might have been the wishful thinking of a man who wanted to see improvement. You would not know for certain until you stopped and felt the swelling again, and you were not ready to stop yet. The snow continued to fall, and you continued to walk, and the circle continued to turn under the darkening sky, and the whole world was reduced to this single yard, this single horse, this single slow ring of wet stone emerging from the whiteness like a promise. Your counting whispered on in your mind, 1 and 2 and 3, a quiet anchor in a sea of stillness, and the mare stepped and scuffed beside you, and the afternoon wore on in its quiet, snowy, unhurried way. The afternoon dimming had begun so gradually that you could not have named the moment when the grey sky became something darker than grey, a slow shift like water cooling in a pot. And it was only when you looked up to find the stable boy crossing the yard with the horn lantern swinging from his hand that you understood the hour had turned. The boy was wrapped in a coat too large for him, the sleeves rolled back 3 times at the cuffs so that his bare wrists showed pale against the dark wool, and he walked with the careful flat-footed tread of someone carrying something breakable across uncertain ground. He did not speak to you as he passed, only raised his chin in a small acknowledging nod, and you returned the nod without breaking your stride, the mare scuffing steadily along beside you in the growing dusk. You watched him reach the lantern post in the center of the yard and lift the lantern onto its hook, a simple iron curve that held it at the height of a man's shoulder. The lantern was a box of horn panes stitched together with leather strips, yellowed and translucent, and inside it a tallow candle stood in a tin socket, unlit until the boy produced a tinder box from his coat pocket and crouched to strike a light. The sound of the flint was a sharp, dry click that cut through the muffled air once and then twice and then a third spark that caught the wick and held. A small flame wavered behind the horn, steadying itself and then the boy closed the little door and stood back to inspect his work. The lantern burned with a warm orange glow that seemed to push softly against the surrounding dimness, creating a pool of light perhaps 8 feet across, beyond which the darkness gathered in patient folds. The boy hurried back to the kitchen without looking at you again, his breath trailing behind him in quick white puffs, and the door opened and closed with its low wooden thump, releasing a momentary gust of warm air that smelled of onions and bread. Then the yard was yours again, and the mare's, but now with the lantern for company. The light changed everything, not in any dramatic way, but in 100 small adjustments that your eyes made as you continued walking. The snowflakes that fell through the lamp's glow caught the orange light and held it for the brief moment of their passage, each flake becoming a tiny traveling spark, a fleck of gold, that drifted down through the dark air and vanished the instant it left the lantern's reach. You found yourself watching these illuminated flakes as you walked, noting how they fell at slightly different speeds, the larger ones drifting more slowly, because their weight was spread across a wider shape, the smaller ones descending faster and straighter, like tiny white darts. The mare seemed to notice the lantern too, her ears pricking forward briefly when it first flared, then relaxing again as she accepted this new element in the familiar yard. The track you had been walking, the dark ring of wet stone that marked your circuit, now showed itself in the lantern light as a glistening line, the moisture on the cobbles catching the glow and throwing it back in a faint, broken shimmer. The untouched snow beyond the track remained a soft, absorbing darkness, a deep blue-grey that drank the light and gave nothing back, so that the path seemed to float like a ribbon on a dark lake. You followed it faithfully, your feet finding the familiar route, and the mare followed you with the same patient scuff of her right forehoof. The sound now seeming louder in the darkness, or perhaps simply more distinct against the greater quiet. The windows of the inn had become golden rectangles that reflected on the wet stones near the kitchen door, their light trembling slightly as people moved within. You could see the shadow of a man's arm lifting a cup in the tap room, the silhouette of the innkeeper's wife bending to stir something on the hearth, and these small domestic motions, so ordinary and so far from you, took on a kind of distant charm, like pictures in a book seen from across a room. The light from the windows fell across the snow in pale yellow stripes that faded after a few feet, and you walked through these stripes on each circuit, the mare's shadow and your own shadow lengthening and shortening as you passed. You would widen the circle slightly without thinking about it, your feet moving a pace farther from the center of the yard to avoid a patch where the stones had become unevenly iced, a shallow depression near the old rain barrel that collected the snowmelt and froze it into a slick, treacherous sheet. The mare followed the adjustment without resistance, her feet finding the safer ground, and you made a mental note to keep the widened path for the night hours when the cold would grow and the ice would spread. The new route added perhaps 5 paces to each circuit, a small change that your counting absorbed easily, the numbers stretching to accommodate the extra steps without losing their steadying rhythm. The snow fell through the lantern light in a continuous slow drift, and you noticed how the flakes near the ground moved differently from those higher up, catching slight eddies and currents that your face could not feel, swirling in miniature spirals before settling onto the track. The sound of the snowfall had changed as the temperature dropped, the soft hiss giving way to a drier sound, a faint whisper like a hand brushing over rough cloth. The mare's breath was thicker now, a white cloud that hung in the lantern light for a full second before dissolving, and her coat had begun to hold the snowflakes without melting them, the individual crystals visible for a few moments against the chestnut hair before they merged into a fine, even dusting. You paused at the lantern post on your 7th or 8th circuit and stood within the pool of light, letting the mare rest her bad leg while you looked up at the sky. There were no stars, no moon, only a uniform darkness that pressed down like a lid, and yet the snow continued to fall from that darkness as if it had no source, as if it were generated by the dark itself. The lantern's candle had burned down perhaps a quarter of its length, the flame steady and upright in the still air, and you calculated vaguely that it would need to be replaced before midnight, a task that the boy or another servant would attend to. You were not responsible for the light, you were responsible only for the circle and the horse. You resumed walking, and the mare resumed her 3 1/2 beat rhythm, the scuff of her right hoof, now a sound you no longer consciously registered, so deeply had it entered your awareness. The cold had intensified with the darkness, a dry, biting cold that pinched at your nostrils and made the insides of your ears ache, and you pulled your hat lower until the brim touched the top of your muffler, leaving only a narrow slot for your eyes. Your feet were entirely numb now, the wet leather of your shoes having given up its last warmth to the stones, and you walked with a slightly altered gait, landing more softly on your heels to absorb the chill in smaller doses. The lantern light revealed details that the daylight had hidden: the fine cracks in the stable wall's mortar, the rust on the iron scraper, the way the thatch over the kitchen roof was woven in 3 distinct layers. The mare's eyelashes, when she turned her head into the light, showed as delicate dark curves against her brown eye, each lash tipped with a tiny droplet of melted snow. Her whiskers, too, caught the light, a fine spray of pale bristles around her muzzle, and you found yourself studying these small things with the absorbed attention that comes from long hours of quiet, the way a child might study the grain of a wooden floor. The inn sounds had grown louder with the evening, or perhaps the darkness simply made them more present, unaccompanied as they were by any visible source. You heard laughter from the tap room, a low rumble of male voices, the clink of pewter on oak, and once a snatch of a song that someone started and then abandoned. The kitchen sounds were sharper and more frequent now, the clatter of pots and the thump of a ladle on a pot rim, and the smell of stew had intensified into something rich with meat and root vegetables, a smell that wrapped around you on each circuit near the kitchen door and then faded as you walked on. You let the smell wash over you without dwelling on it. You would eat when the walking was done, and the walking would not be done for many hours yet. A second window lit up as someone brought a candle into an upper room, a small square of gold high in the inn's facade, and you watched it for a moment before returning your gaze to the track. The mare's right forehoof left its characteristic smear in the snow, and you checked the leg each time you passed the lantern, glancing down to see if the swelling had changed shape or size. In the warm light, the fetlock looked unchanged, the slight puffiness above the joint casting a small shadow that moved with her stride, and you took this stability as a good sign. The boy came out again some time later, carrying a fresh candle for the lantern, and he swapped the old stub for the new taper with quick, practiced movements, shielding the flame from the snow with his cupped palm. He glanced at you as he worked, and you saw that he wanted to say something, perhaps to ask about the mare, or to offer some small comfort, but he did not speak, and neither did you. He finished his task and retreated to the kitchen, and the renewed lantern burned slightly brighter than before, the flame taller and more vigorous, throwing its gold circle a few inches wider across the snow. You walked on. The darkness beyond the lantern's reach had become complete, an absolute black that pressed against the inn walls and filled the archway to the road with an opaque void. The snow fell out of that void and into the light, a continuous procession of flakes moving from the unseen to the seen and back to the unseen, and you thought about how many flakes must be falling across the whole Great North Road, across the fields and the villages and the dark woods, all of them falling with the same quiet steadiness, the same patient indifference. The thought should have been lonely, but it was not. There was comfort in the scale of it, the way your small circle in your small yard was part of a vast silent event that covered half the country. The mare's warmth beside you was a steady presence in the cold, and you leaned slightly toward her as you walked, sharing the heat of her body through the layers of your clothing. She did not seem to mind the proximity, and in fact she pressed her shoulder gently against your arm once as you turned a corner, a brief moment of contact that felt like an acknowledgement, a small gesture of companionship between two creatures walking out a long night together. You let your hand rest on her neck for a full circuit, feeling the coarse hair and the solid muscle beneath, and you felt her pulse beating low and steady under your fingertips. The lantern, the falling snow, the glistening track, the golden windows, the muffled inn sounds, the mare's easy breath, and your own slow steps all merged into a single continuous experience that had no sharp edges and no clear divisions. The darkness held the yard in a soft bowl, and you walked the rim of it over and over, and the hours passed in their quiet, invisible way, marked only by the gradual sinking of the candle in the horn lantern, and the slow accumulation of snow on every surface that could hold it. The first night settled over the inn yard, not as a sudden change, but as a slow thickening of the darkness, a gradual deepening that began at the walls and moved inward, until even the lantern's reach seemed to shrink. its pool of light contracting to a circle barely wide enough to hold the two of you. The snow that had been falling all afternoon and evening had not paused or lessened. It came down now with a steady, heavier purpose, the flakes smaller and drier than before, rattling faintly against the lantern's horn panes with a sound like distant seed grain trickling onto a wooden floor. The inn's windows had gone dark one by one. First the upper room with its small square of candlelight, then the taproom window that had glowed the longest, its yellow warmth winking out and leaving only the kitchen's faint glimmer, where someone still moved in the small hours, perhaps banking the fire for the night. You were alone now with the mare and the lantern and the snow, and the night stretched ahead without any visible ending. The track you had been walking had changed its character entirely under the accumulation. Earlier it had been a dark, wet ring on grey cobbles, but now the whole yard wore a smooth white blanket, perhaps 2 inches thick, and your circuit was a pressed-down path of compacted snow that had been trodden and retrodden until it was firm as felt underfoot. The mare's hooves no longer struck stone with a sharp scuff, but landed with a muffled double scrape, a soft shush-shush sound as her right forehoof dragged slightly through the packed layer, followed by the lighter settling of her other 3 feet. Your own shoes made a quiet crunching noise that seemed very loud to you in the deep silence, each step a small announcement of your presence that faded instantly into the snow-choked air. The cold had become something you no longer fought but inhabited, a condition as constant as the darkness itself. Your fingers inside your gloves had stiffened around the halter rope, the joints aching with a dull persistence that you could ease only by flexing them one at a time, a small ritual you performed every few circuits without stopping. The rope itself had grown rigid, the hemp fibers frozen into a hard, unyielding twist that bit into your palm even through the wool. You switched hands more frequently now, tucking the free hand into your armpit to warm it, while the other held the mare's lead, and the exchange became another automatic rhythm layered onto the walking, the counting, the breathing. Your thoughts, unmoored by the monotony, drifted often to the kitchen you could not yet return to. You pictured the great hearth with its banked coals glowing softly under a layer of ash, the warmth still radiating into the flagged floor, and the long wooden table where the servants sat for their meals. You imagined the settle by the fire, its hard oak seat softened by a folded blanket, and the way the heat would press against your face and chest if you were to sit there now, closing your eyes and letting the cold drain out of your bones into the floor. You thought of the bowl of stew that had been simmering all day, the thick broth and the soft carrots and the shreds of mutton, and how it would taste after hours of walking in the snow, the first spoonful so hot it would scald your tongue, the bread beside it, fresh from the morning's baking, with a crust that cracked under pressure. These thoughts were not urgent, they were gentle, almost dreamlike, and they passed through your mind on each circuit like the lantern light passing over the mare's back, illuminating something briefly, and then moving on. The inn signboard creaked in the distance, its sound carrying across the yard from the road frontage in irregular pulses that seemed to follow the wind's slow breathing. The creak was low and wooden, a groan of seasoned oak on iron hinges, and each time it came you found yourself waiting for it without knowing you were waiting, only noticing when it arrived and then noticing when it left, the silence after its departure seeming deeper than before. The wind that moved the sign was a barely perceptible drift of air that came from the north, not strong enough to lift the snow, but steady enough to keep the sign in motion, and it carried with it the faint, clean smell of open fields under snow, a smell so distant and so pure that it made the inn yard feel like a small ship adrift on a white ocean. The mare's condition continued to hold steady through the night hours, her limp neither improving nor worsening, the slight heat above her fetlock a constant presence under your periodic touch. You stopped every quarter hour now, or what you judged to be a quarter hour, to run your hand down the leg and feel the swelling, and each time the skin was warm but not hot, the puffiness soft and contained, exactly as it had been at dusk. The mare stood patiently during these examinations, her weight shifted onto her good legs, her head turned back toward you, with one dark eye catching the lantern light, as if checking that you were still there. Her breath came in deep, slow exhalations that clouded the air round her muzzle and then cleared, and her coat had become entirely frosted with a fine white layer of frozen breath and settled snow, making her look older than she was, a ghost horse walking an eternal circle. The double scrape of her hooves became the metronome of the night, a steady pulse that you followed without thought, your own feet matching its rhythm exactly. The sound was so constant that when you stopped to rest her leg, the sudden quiet felt like a physical absence, a missing note in a melody you had been hearing so long it had become part of your own body. During these rest stops you would stand beside the lantern post, letting the mare's bad leg unload its weight, and you would look up at the invisible sky and try to gauge the progress of the night by the depth of the snow on the lantern's top, which now wore a rounded white cap that grew taller each time you checked. The candle inside the lantern burned steadily, its flame a small gold tongue that never flickered in the windless center of the yard, and you knew that if it burned for 6 hours on a single candle, and the boy had replaced it perhaps 2 hours into the evening, then you had several hours yet before the night was even half spent. Your body had entered a state of sustained endurance that felt almost like floating, the exhaustion held at bay by the steady rhythm of motion. Your legs moved of their own accord, your feet lifted and fell in the trampled track, and your mind wandered freely across the landscape of small memories and half-formed images. You thought of other horses you had walked in other winters, a bay gelding with a strained tendon at an inn near Doncaster, a grey mare with a stone bruise at a coaching station outside Stamford, their faces and gaits surfacing in your recollection with the clarity of things long past. You thought of the road itself, the Great North Road that lay under the snow beyond the arch, its usual traffic of coaches and riders and postboys and cattle droves suspended entirely, the whole length of it from London to York lying silent and white under the same steady fall. The thought of all that emptiness was somehow comforting, as if the whole world had agreed to pause and rest, and you were simply one part of that great pause. The snow continued to fall, and the track continued to compact under your passing, and the circle continued to turn. The lantern's pool of light showed you the mare's shadow walking beside her, a dark shape on the snow that elongated and shortened with each step, and your own shadow walking behind like a taller companion. The three of you, the horse and the man and the shadow man, circled the yard together in a quiet procession that had no beginning and no end. The inn walls, coated now in a vertical layer of snow that clung to the rough stone, loomed dimly at the edge of the light, their outlines softened so that they seemed less like buildings and more like natural formations, outcroppings of rock shaped by centuries of weather. You began to notice the smaller sounds that existed beneath the snow's whisper and the mare's footfall, sounds that the daytime had hidden. There was a faint ticking from the stable roof as the thatch contracted in the cold, a series of tiny clicks like an insect's song. There was the almost inaudible creak of the kitchen door's lever hinges easing themselves tighter. There was the distant, buried sound of the inn's foundation settling into the frozen ground, a sound you felt more than heard, a low vibration that travelled up through the stones and into your numb feet. These sounds arranged themselves into a sort of night music, a quiet composition played by the inn itself, and you listened to it with the detached attention of a man who had nothing else to hear. The mare shook her head once, a sudden movement that sent a spray of snow from her mane and made the halter buckles jingle, and the sound was startlingly loud in the deep quiet, a brief percussion that died away instantly. You reached up to brush the snow from her forelock, your stiff fingers clumsy on the coarse hair, and she leaned into the touch for a moment before resuming her steady walk. The gesture had cost you a small amount of warmth, your hand emerging from the shelter of your armpit into the biting air, and you tucked it back quickly, feeling the cold already settling into the exposed fingertips. The kitchen door opened briefly, a crack of yellow light that widened and then closed, and the innkeeper's dog trotted out, his paws sinking into the fresh snow with a series of small craters. He circled the yard once, sniffing at the track your circuits had made, then lifted his leg against the corner of the stable wall and trotted back to the door, waiting with a patient expression until someone let him in. You had not paused your walking for this small interruption, and the mare had not acknowledged the dog at all. The door closed, the light vanished, and the night resumed its undisturbed course. Hours passed that could have been minutes, or minutes that could have been hours, the time stretching and compressing in the way that it does when there are no clocks and no changing light. You measured the night by the depth of the snow on your hat brim, which you brushed off periodically only to have it build again, and by the slow sinking of the candle in the lantern, which had burned down to a stub, perhaps an inch tall, its flame now surrounded by a yellow halo of translucent horn. The mare's double scrape continued without variation, and your canting continued beneath your thoughts, and the creak of the inn signboard came and went like a distant voice calling across water. Your thoughts drifted again to the kitchen, and this time you allowed yourself a more detailed imagining. You saw the servant girl asleep on the settle, her head pillowed on her arm, the firelight flickering over her apron. You saw the innkeeper's wife moving quietly to set the morning's dough to rise, her hands dusted with flour, her movements slow with the hour. You saw the pot of stew pushed to the side of the hearth, its lid slightly askew, a thin curl of steam still rising from the gap. These images brought you a kind of quiet comfort, a reminder that the world of warmth and food and rest still existed, and would still exist when your duty was done. You did not hurry toward it. The mare needed the walking, and the walking needed the hours, and you were simply the instrument of that necessity. The mare's lame leg had begun to show a very slight improvement. Or perhaps you were imagining it, but the drag of her right hoof seemed a fraction less pronounced than it had been at midnight. The double scrape a little softer, the pause between it and the next footfall a little shorter. You checked the swelling again and thought the heat was marginally reduced, a subtle cooling that might have been real or might have been the effect of the cold air on your own sensation. You did not trust your judgment entirely, but you allowed yourself a small private hope, a thing you held quietly and did not examine too closely. The night wore on, and the snow continued, and the inn sign creaked, and the lantern burned its last inch of candle, and you walked the circle with the mare beside you, your shadow and her shadow moving together across the white ground. The cold had become something absolute, a presence as real as the horse or the lantern or the snow, and you moved through it with the slow patience of a man who knew that the only way out was through, step by step, circuit by circuit, until the sky began its long, slow turn toward dawn. The light on the second morning arrived not as a sunrise but as a gradual thinning of the darkness, a slow dilution of black into deep grey, and then into a paler grey that revealed the yard in layers, as if a curtain were being lifted one fold at a time. The snow had not stopped during the night, and it continued to fall as you had last seen it, a steady procession of small dry flakes that drifted down through the still air with the same unhurried patience, the same endless supply. The world beyond the inn walls was entirely white and soft-edged, every surface rounded and muffled, and the yard itself lay under a smooth blanket that had grown overnight to a depth of perhaps 4 inches. The snow so even and unbroken that it looked like a single clean sheet drawn over the stones. Except for the ring, the dark ring of your walking was visible now, with a clarity that the night had hidden, a continuous oval track pressed into the snow so firmly that it stood out against the surrounding whiteness, like a line drawn in charcoal on fresh paper. The packed snow within the track had been compressed by the weight of the mare and yourself into a dense greyish-white path that was slightly lower than the untouched snow on either side, its surface textured with the overlapping impressions of hooves and shoes, a palimpsest of movement written over and over until the individual marks had merged into a single smooth channel. The track glistened faintly where the pressure had squeezed out a thin glaze of ice, and it curved around the yard in a shape you now knew so intimately that you could have walked it blindfolded, each bend and straight section mapped in your muscles and your bones. The mare walked beside you with the same steady 3 1/2 beat rhythm, her right forehoof still dragging that fraction of a second behind, but in the pale dawn light you could see that the swelling above her fetlock had diminished slightly during the night hours, the puffiness now a gentle curve rather than a distinct lump. She moved with what seemed to you a shade more ease, her head not hanging quite so low, her ears now active in a way they had not been during the deep dark, turning this way and that as she processed the small sounds of the waking inn. Her coat had lost its frosty coating and was merely damp now, the chestnut color showing through in rich dark patches where the snow had melted against her warmth, and her breath curled out in steady white plumes that rose and scattered into the falling flakes. The stable block, which had been silent throughout the night except for the occasional tick of contracting thatch, had begun to stir. As you passed the stable door on each circuit, you heard the grey gelding shifting in his stall, his hooves making a dull thump on the straw-laid cobbles, followed by a long rattling snort that vibrated through the wooden partition. The sound came at irregular intervals, sometimes 2 circuits apart and sometimes 3, and you noticed that the mare's ears flicked every single time she passed that door. They turned backward for a moment, cupped toward the sound, then swung forward again as she continued her slow walk, a small, reflexive acknowledgement of the other horse's restlessness. She did not call back or change her pace. She simply noted the gelding's presence and let it pass, the way a person might glance at a familiar face in a window without stopping. The gelding's snorts were followed by a stamping of his near hind hoof, a heavier sound than the mare's careful steps, a sound of impatience, or perhaps just of a horse waking up and finding himself still confined. You imagined him with his head over the stall door, ears pricked toward the yard, watching the two of you circle past with a mild, uncomprehending curiosity. The bay horse in the next stall remained quiet, perhaps still dozing, and the contrast between the gelding's active snorting and the bay's silence made the stable feel alive in a new way. A building that was slowly filling with the small noises of the morning. The track beneath your feet had become so well defined that you no longer needed to look down to follow it, your feet finding the compacted path automatically, the slight depression guiding you as surely as a rutted lane. You could feel the difference under your shoes, even through the numbness that still lingered in your soles, the packed snow offering a firmer than the softer white beside it. And you noticed that when you drifted slightly off the track, your feet sank a little deeper, a small correction that your body made without conscious thought. The mare too kept to the track with the same instinctive precision, her hooves landing exactly within the depressed channel, her bad legs still scuffing a soft drag mark into the greyish surface. The dawn light continued to strengthen, though the sky remained a uniform grey, without any break, the sun entirely hidden behind the thick cloud that produced the snow. The light that reached the yard was diffuse and shadowless, a pale illumination that seemed to come from every direction at once, making the white snow glow with a faint internal radiance. The dark track absorbed this light rather than reflecting it, so that it appeared even darker by contrast, a charcoal line on a white page. The lantern on the post had burned out at some point during the early hours, its candle reduced to a small pool of wax that had frozen into a creamy puddle around the tin socket, and in the daylight the horn panes looked yellow and opaque, like old parchment held up to a window. The inn's windows had begun to show the first signs of morning activity, a faint smoke rising from the kitchen chimney that curled upward and then spread out flat under the low cloud layer, and the glow of a fresh fire flickering behind the oiled paper of the kitchen window. You heard the innkeeper's wife moving inside, the clank of the iron kettle being set on its hook, the scrape of a pan across the hearthstone, all sounds that you had heard 1,000 times before and that now carried across the snow-muffled yard with a soft, rounded quality, as if they were wrapped in wool. The kitchen door remained closed, but the smell of the new fire drifted out through the gaps, a sharp, clean scent of burning beechwood that cut through the cold air and mingled with the snow's mineral freshness. The gelding stamped again as you passed the stable, a loud triple beat of his hoof against the stall floor, and the mare's ears flicked back so promptly that it might have been a reflex, an involuntary response that came from some deep equine instinct. Her head turned slightly toward the sound, her dark eye rolling back to catch a glimpse of the stable interior, and then she faced forward again and continued her measured walk without the slightest change in her pace. You found this small twitch of attention oddly reassuring, a sign that the mare was alert and comfortable enough to notice her surroundings, not sunk into the dull endurance of pain that you had seen in other horses with worse injuries. She was healing, you thought, slowly and in her own time, and the flick of her ears was a signal that her spirit was still fully present. The track had begun to develop a slight hollow sound under the mare's hooves, a subtle change from the soft shush-shush of the night to a crisper, drier note, as if the compressed snow were freezing harder with the morning cold. The temperature had dropped a degree or two since dawn, the air now sharp enough to sting your nostrils with each inhalation, and the snowflakes had become smaller and more crystalline, their edges catching the diffuse light in tiny sparks. They settled on the mare's back in a fine, glittering dust that did not melt, and when she shook her head once, the motion sent a small cloud of these crystals puffing outward into the grey air, where they hung for a moment, before drifting down to join the rest. You had been walking now for the whole of the night and the whole of the previous day, and your body had passed beyond tiredness into a state of remote, floating wakefulness. Your legs moved without any sense of effort. Your feet lifted and fell in the track with the mechanical regularity of a clock escapement, and your mind observed the yard and the snow, and the mare and the grey gelding snorts with a detached calm that felt almost pleasant. The exhaustion was there somewhere beneath the surface, you knew, but for now it was held at bay by the rhythm and the cold and the simple necessity of continuing. You passed the mounting block on each circuit, its flat upper surface now wearing a thick white cushion of snow, and you noted how the stone's edges had been completely softened, the sharp corners rounded into gentle curves. The rain barrel had accumulated a high white dome on its lid, and the icicle of the spigot had grown overnight to the length of your hand, a clear tapering spike that caught the light and held it. The kitchen garden wall wore a continuous white coping that overhung the stones by an inch, and beneath it the raspberry canes had vanished entirely, only the faintest suggestion of their shapes remaining as elongated bumps in the snow. Everything that had been angular and hard was now curved and soft, the world transformed by the patient accumulation of a million individual flakes. The grey geldings snorted again, this time a longer, more elaborate noise that ended in a low nicker, the kind of sound a horse makes when it wants to be noticed, and the mare's ears swiveled back with a quick, precise movement. She did not nicker in return, but she did slow her pace for a single step, her right forehoof dragging just a fraction longer across the packed snow, before resuming her regular rhythm. He reached up and scratched the coarse hair behind her ear, a small gesture of reassurance, and she leaned into your fingers for a moment, her eye half closing, before straightening and continuing the walk. You glanced toward the stable and saw nothing but the dark rectangle of the open doorway, but you could hear the gelding moving inside, his hooves shifting in the straw, the wood of his stall creaking as he shifted his weight. The track was now so distinct that it had become a feature of the yard, an indelible mark that would remain long after the snow stopped and the thaw came, at least in your memory. You could see the exact places where you had widened the path to avoid the frozen puddle, the slight outward curve near the rain barrel, the straight section along the kitchen garden wall where you had walked single file beside the mare, your footsteps overlapping hers. The overlapping impressions had blended into a continuous grey ribbon that looped around the central lantern post, which stood like a dark island in a white sea, its base surrounded by a small moat of trampled snow where you had paused to rest the mare's leg. The inn's morning sounds grew louder and more numerous as the hour advanced. The kitchen door opened and closed twice, releasing puffs of warm air that fogged into the cold and drifted across the yard. The voice of the innkeeper's wife calling something to a servant, the rattle of a chain as the dog was let out to sniff at the snow, and then hurried back inside. The dog's paw prints made a brief wandering trail across the yard that crossed your track at several points, and then looped back to the door, a pattern that the snow was already beginning to erase as the fresh flakes filled the little hollows. You observed all this with the same calm, floating attention, registering each small event as it occurred and then letting it go. The mare's right foreleg continued to show that small but definite improvement, the swelling now not much more than a slight fullness above the joint, and when you paused to feel it the heat was barely perceptible, a faint warmth that might have been nothing more than the normal heat of living tissue. You ran your hand down the leg from knee to coronet, feeling the cool hard edge of the cannon bone and the soft give of the tendon, and everything felt as it should feel, smooth and elastic and sound. The mare stood with her weight evenly distributed now, not favoring the leg as obviously as she had the day before, and when she walked on after the pause, the drag of her hoof was so slight that you had to listen closely to hear it above the snow's whisper. The track beckoned you onward, and you followed it, the mare following you, the gelding stamping again as you passed the stable door, the mare's ears flicking back and then forward, the snow falling with its quiet, tireless continuity. The dark ring on the white ground remained your guide and your destination and your path all at once, and you walked it with the same patience you had brought to every circuit since the first flake fell, knowing that the day ahead would be no different from the night just past, a long stretch of slow time in which nothing was required of you except to keep moving and to keep the horse moving alongside you. The snow on the second day fell not in the lazy, drifting way it had begun, but with a thicker, straighter purpose, the flakes smaller and more numerous, descending in dense vertical lines that filled the air until the far side of the yard became a pale suggestion rather than a solid wall. The track you walked remained visible beneath this fresh deposition, a grey channel that the new snow could not quite erase because your feet in the mare's hooves were continually pressing it back into existence. But the space between circuits now saw the path begin to fill, its edges softening and blurring so that each time you came around you were walking on a surface that had been partially renewed. A thin layer of fresh white over the old compacted grey. The road beyond the archway had been completely erased, not merely covered but erased. The distinction between the road and the ditch and the field on either side smoothed over into a single unbroken plane of white that stretched away toward the invisible horizon. No wheel ruts marked it, no hoof prints, no human tracks, nothing but the clean, featureless snow that had absorbed the road's very existence and replaced it with a silence so deep it seemed to press against your ears. The archway itself had become a frame for that blankness, a stone rectangle opening onto nothing, and you found yourself glancing toward it on each circuit with a quiet sense of wonder, the way one might glance at a painting of an empty landscape. The great coaching route that had carried thousands of travellers between the two cities lay dormant under the same patient snowfall that was covering the yard, the same flakes settling on the thatch and the stable roof and the inn sign and the empty road, without distinction. You had not realized how accustomed you were to the possibility of arrival until the possibility had been withdrawn, and now the inn felt like a small island in a still white sea, entirely self-contained, entirely sufficient. The mare walked beside you with the same steady limp that was no longer really a limp, but a slight hesitation in her stride, a tiny catch in the rhythm that you felt through the halter rope as a minuscule interruption of flow. Her right forehoof still came down a fraction later than the others, the snow receiving it with a soft puff of displaced powder, but the hesitation had grown so subtle that you sometimes had to look down to confirm it was still there. The swelling above her fetlock had reduced to a gentle fullness that could have been the natural contour of the joint, and the heat that had worried you the day before was now so faint that your cold fingers could barely detect it through your glove. She was healing, slowly and steadily, the way a cold stream heals a bruise, and the walking was doing its quiet work. The innkeeper's wife came out of the kitchen door a little before midday, though midday was a guess based on the quality of the light rather than any certainty, the sun being as invisible as it had been for the past 2 days. She was a solid woman in a brown wool dress with a white apron tied over it, the apron already marked with flour and something dark that might have been gravy, and she carried a wooden bowl in both hands, holding it carefully so that the liquid inside did not slop over the rim. The bowl was the same plain beechwood kind that the servants used, smooth from years of handling, and the steam that rose from it curled upward in a lazy spiral that the snow seemed to part around, the flakes dissolving before they could reach the hot surface. She did not call out to you or interrupt your walking, but stood by the lantern post in the center of the yard, waiting with the patience of a woman who had fed many grooms and many coachmen over many winters and knew that a man walking a horse could not simply stop wherever he was. You completed the circuit you were on, turning the corner by the stable and passing the mounting block and the rain barrel. And then you angled the mare gently inward so that your track looped toward the lantern post instead of continuing along the wall. The mare came willingly, her head lifting slightly at the smell of the broth, and you halted her beside the post with her lame leg eased, the hoof resting just above the snow so that the strained tendon bore no weight at all. The innkeeper's wife handed you the bowl without ceremony, and you took it in both hands, the warmth of the wood seeping through your gloves and into your stiff palms with an almost painful relief. She did not linger. She said something brief and low about the cold and the snow, and something else that you did not quite catch because the words were already half-spoken, as she turned away. And then she was walking back to the kitchen door, her shoes leaving deep prints in the snow that the mare's track crossed and recrossed. You lifted the bowl to your face and breathed in the steam before you drank, the vapor warming your cheeks and the bridge of your nose, and the smell of the broth was rich with marrow and barley and the faint, sweet sharpness of onion. You did not hurry. There was no reason to hurry, and the mare needed the pause for her leg, the rest as much a part of the treatment as the motion. So you stood in the falling snow with the bowl at your lips and let the warmth spread through you in slow waves. The broth was thick enough to coat the wooden spoon that rested in the bowl, and you ate it slowly, not bothering to use the spoon for the liquid, but sipping directly from the rim, the way a man does when he is alone and cold and unconcerned with appearance. The first mouthful was almost too hot, scalding the tip of your tongue, and you blew across the surface after that, sending the steam into wider curls that merged with your own slow exhales until you could not tell which vapor was broth and which was breath. The mare stood beside you with her head low and her eyes half closed, resting in the way that horses do when they are content. One hind hoof tipped so that only the toe touched the snow, her weight distributed across the 3 sound legs with the ease of long practice. The snow gathered on her back and on your shoulders and on the brim of your hat, but the warmth of the bowl in your hands made the cold feel distant, a thing that existed somewhere beyond the small circle of comfort you were holding. You finished the broth and stood for a moment longer, holding the empty bowl and feeling the residual heat fade from the wood into your gloves. The innkeeper's wife would not expect the bowl back until you were done with your walking, so you set it on the flat stone of the mounting block beside a small drift of snow, and the snow immediately began to accumulate on its rim, softening its outline. The mare lifted her head as you took up the halter rope again, and she shifted her weight back onto the right foreleg with the same careful deliberation, testing it before she committed. You waited until she was settled, and then you clicked your tongue softly and stepped back onto the track, the mare following with her scuff and her nod and her slow, accommodating rhythm. The snow had thickened still further during the brief pause, the flakes now falling so densely that the archway was a solid wall of moving white, the road beyond it not even a suggestion. The quiet had deepened correspondingly, the snow absorbing every sound that the inn produced so that even the clatter from the kitchen seemed remote and unimportant, a distant noise from another world. You could hear the hiss of the flakes as they met the packed snow of the track, a sound like 1,000 tiny exhalations, and you could hear the mare's breathing, steady and deep, and you could hear your own footsteps crunching with that same muffled, compressed note, and beneath all of these you could hear the absence of everything else, the profound silence that had settled over the country like a second snowfall. No travelers arrived. None had arrived since the first flake fell 2 days ago, and the inn, which normally bustled with the constant turnover of passengers and post-boys and private riders, had become a sealed vessel, its inhabitants reduced to the innkeeper and his wife and the servants and yourself, and the 3 horses in the stable. The tap room stood empty, its benches unused, its fire burning down to coals that no one troubled to replenish. The rooms above the yard were dark and cold, their beds stripped and their windows shuttered, waiting for a thaw that might not come for days. You thought about the coach that should have arrived yesterday, and the riders who should have passed through, and the post that should have been carried north, all of it suspended, all of it buried under the same white blanket that covered the yard. This thought did not trouble you. It was simply a fact of the weather, an accepted condition that required no response. You had no urgent business elsewhere, no message to deliver, no place to be. Your duty was here with this mare and this track and this steady, hypnotic walking, and the rest of the world could remain frozen and silent for as long as it needed. The quiet that came with the absence of travelers was a quiet you welcomed, a stillness that allowed you to sink deeper into the rhythm of the circuit without interruption. You had walked this track so many times now that it felt less like a task and more like a kind of meditation, a slow, physical prayer offered to the small god of healing and patience. The mare's leg held steady through the afternoon, neither worsening nor showing dramatic improvement, simply maintaining that small gain that had appeared with the dawn. You checked it once every half-dozen circuits, bending to run your hand down the cool, damp hair of her cannon bone, and each time the leg felt the same, a little warm, a little full, but essentially sound. A leg that was mending in its own time. The mare tolerated these examinations with the same placid acceptance she had shown from the beginning, standing quietly while you prodded and felt. Her weight shifted slightly to relieve the pressure on the strained tendon. When you straightened up and began walking again, she fell into step beside you as if she had never stopped, her head low and her ears relaxed. The broth's warmth stayed with you for a long while, a gentle glow in your stomach that radiated outward to your chest and your limbs, and the slow exhales that accompanied your walking carried the faint aftertaste of barley and mutton, a savory reminder of the kitchen's comfort. The steam of your breath and the memory of the bowl's steam merged in your mind until they became the same thing, a continuous thread of warmth that connected the kitchen and the lantern post and the track and the mare, binding the whole yard into a single quiet entity. You walked on, and the snow continued its straight descent, and the road remained invisible, and the afternoon wore on toward its slow, inevitable darkening. The inn sounds had become so muted by the snow that they reached you as gentle pressure changes rather than distinct noises. A soft thump that might have been a door closing, a murmur that might have been a voice, a faint scrape that might have been a chair on flagstones. You no longer tried to identify these sounds. You simply let them wash over you and recede, part of the background texture of the day. The dog barked once, a single muffled note, and then fell silent, and the snow swallowed the bark as it swallowed everything else. You thought about the innkeeper's wife, the way she had stood waiting with the bowl, her hands steady despite the cold, her face holding an expression of calm competence. She had not fussed over you or asked about the mare or offered to take a turn at the walking. She had simply brought the broth and then gone back to her work, trusting you to do yours. That trust was a quiet gift, a recognition that you were capable and that the mare was in good hands. You appreciated it without articulating the appreciation, letting it settle into your thoughts like a stone dropping into deep water. The track continued, and you continued with it, the mare beside you and the snow around you, and the silence beneath you, the whole afternoon, a single slow breath drawn out over hours of patient, uncomplaining walking. By the third day, you had entered a state of attention so fine and so quiet that the smallest details of the yard presented themselves to you as if they were objects under a magnifying lens, each one distinct and separate and worthy of long examination. The snow had not stopped falling, though its character had shifted once again, and now it came as a fine, dry powder that sifted down through the grey air with a silence so complete that you could hear the individual flakes settling onto the shoulders of your coat, a sound like the brush of a feather against wool. The track beneath your feet had been compressed by 3 days of continuous walking into a ribbon of grey ice-speckled snow that was now almost as hard as the cobbles underneath, and your shoes made a crisp, granular sound on it, a sound that belonged more to the frost than to the snow. The mare's coat occupied much of your attention during those long hours. It was a short, dense coat, the color of chestnuts fresh from the husk, and it lay flat and smooth over her shoulders and flanks except where the walking had warmed her enough to raise it slightly, a subtle ruffling that caught the light and made a pattern of tiny shadows. The individual hairs were not all one color, but a range of browns from deep mahogany near the roots to a lighter russet at the tips. And when she turned her neck, the light shifted across these strata in a slow wave. The snow that fell on her back no longer melted, but remained as a crystalline dusting that outlined the contours of her spine and her ribs and the gentle slope of her hindquarters, a white map drawn on a red-brown landscape. You had never studied a horse's coat so closely before, not in all your years with horses, and the study brought you a quiet, absorbing pleasure. The swelling above her fetlock had become, by the third afternoon, a slight puffiness that was warm only in the center, a small residual heat that you could feel if you pressed your thumb into the hollow just above the joint, the skin there thin and soft and the texture of worn velvet. The rest of the leg had cooled to normal, the tendon lying flat and smooth, the cannon bone hard and unyielding under your fingers. When the mare walked, the hesitation was still present, that tiny nod of the head and that fractional delay of the hoof. But it was now so subtle that only someone who had watched her for 3 days would notice it. A signature rather than a symptom. A way of moving that had become habitual, even as the pain that caused it faded. You wondered whether she would ever walk entirely evenly again, or whether this slight catch in her stride would remain as a permanent reminder of the deep snow week, and the wondering was idle and without urgency, a thought to be turned over and examined, and then set aside. Her eyes you studied too, the dark brown iris with its soft, liquid depth, the long lashes that caught the snowflakes and held them for a moment before they melted, the way the pupil contracted almost imperceptibly when the grey sky brightened briefly and then dilated again. The mare's gaze was calm and unfocused, looking at nothing in particular, seeing the yard and the snow and the lantern post and the track as a continuous blur of grey and white that required no response. There was a patience in her eyes that you found restful, an acceptance of the present moment that humans rarely achieved, and when she turned her head to look directly at you, the contact was brief and gentle, a checking in that said, "I am here, you are here, we are still walking together," nothing more. The track itself became an object of study as the hours passed. You examined the texture of its surface, the way the repeated hoof prints and footprints have merged into a continuous pattern of overlapping impressions, each one a faint echo of the one that came before. The mare's right forehoof left its characteristic smear, a long, shallow drag mark that cut across the other prints at a slight angle, and you could see exactly where her weight had been lightest, the impression shallower there than on the other 3 feet. The edges of the track were not sharp, but slightly crumbled. Loose granules of snow that had been pushed outward by the pressure of your passing, and now lay in a thin, scattered border. In a few places, a tiny ridge of ice had formed along the edge, a miniature moraine that glittered when the light caught it. The icicles on the stable roof were another small fascination. They had grown day by day, fed by the slow melt of the snow that lay against the thatch, the warmth of the horses inside rising through the roof and freeing just enough water to drip over the eaves before the cold seized it again. The icicles hung in a ragged row along the entire length of the stable block, varying in length from a few inches to nearly 2 feet, their surfaces marked with faint horizontal rings that showed the stages of their growth. They were not clear like glass, but slightly cloudy, full of tiny bubbles and imperfections, and their tips were needle-sharp, tapering to points that seemed to draw the eye downward. When the wind lifted briefly, the longest icicle swayed a fraction of an inch, and the movement produced a faint creaking sound that was different from the ensign's groan, a higher and more delicate note. The change in the snow's sound was something you noticed gradually over the course of the 3rd day and into the 4th, a slow transformation that mirrored the falling temperature. On the 1st day, the snow had fallen with a soft hiss, almost an exhalation, the flakes large and wet enough to make a sound as they landed. On the 2nd day, that hiss had become a whisper, the flakes smaller and drier, and their collective sound more like the rustle of silk. By the 3rd day, as the cold deepened and the flakes grew finer still, the sound had become a dry, faint sibilance that was less a noise and more the edge of a noise, a susurration so quiet that you had to stop walking and hold your breath to hear it. On the 4th day, with the temperature now hard and bitter and the snow reduced to a crystalline dust, there was almost no sound at all, only a sense of motion in the air and the occasional tick of a flake striking your hat or the mare's coat. The silence had become absolute, a thing with weight and texture. Your own legs had become objects of detached observation, moving beneath you with the same automatic regularity as the mare's. Your stride lengthened and shortened by the subtle camber of the yard until you knew every variation of the ground without having to look. Your calf muscles had hardened with the effort of so many hours of slow walking, and you noticed a slight ache in your hips that came and went, a deep, dull sensation that was not unpleasant. Your thighs moved under your wool trousers with a mechanical smoothness, the fabric stiff from the cold and from the moisture that had frozen into its weave, making a faint rasping sound when your legs brushed together. You had become a walking mechanism, a device of bone and muscle and leather, whose sole function was to trace this circle and pull this halter and keep this horse in motion, and the simplification of purpose was strangely restful. The mare's hoof prints blurred into the track in the same way over and over, her right forehoof leaving its drag mark and the other 3 leaving deeper, cleaner impressions that filled almost instantly with a drifting powder, so that by the time you came around again the prints were already softened and obscured. The track was a palimpsest, continually written and continually erased, always the same and always new. You thought about the snow as a great recording medium, a surface that received every mark and then covered it, and you thought about the thousands of circuits you had already walked, all of them vanished, all of them existing only in the memory of your muscles and the mare's healing leg. The thatch on the stable roof, which you had noted on the 1st day for its faint green tinge of moss, was now entirely hidden under a thick white blanket that overhung the eaves in a smooth, rounded lip. The weight of the snow had compressed the thatch slightly, pressing it down so that the roofline sagged in the middle by an inch or 2, a soft curve that the eye followed like a slow melody. The straw ends that poked through the snow along the ridge line were the only sign that there was thatch beneath, a series of small dark tufts that looked like an animal's hackles raised against the cold. You studied the way the snow accumulated differently on each surface of the yard. On the flat coping stones of the garden wall, it lay in a perfect even layer, its upper surface as smooth as cream on a bowl. On the rough stone of the inn wall it clung in vertical streaks, filling the crevices and leaving the raised edges bare, a pattern of white and grey that reminded you of the hide of a dappled horse. On the lantern post, it wrapped around the iron in a thick cylinder, and on the horn panes of the lantern itself, which was slightly warm from the candle that the boy still came to replace, it melted on contact and refroze into a thin blaze of ice that clouded the horn and softened the light. On the mounting block it formed a rounded dome, and on the rain barrel it built up in concentric rings around the rim. The third day passed into the fourth, and the fourth day wore on in its quiet, unchanging way, and your small observations continued to accumulate, a catalogue of minute details that filled your mind and kept the monotony from becoming strain. You were no longer tired in the ordinary sense. You had passed through tired and into a state of wakeful calm, a quiet alertness that noticed everything and judged nothing. The mare walked beside you, and the snow fell around you, and the track carried you forward in its endless gentle loop. The snow now lay so thick against the yard door that the bottom of the archway had disappeared behind a drift that sloped upward from the ground to a height of perhaps 3 feet, sealing the inn off from the road as effectively as a gate made of white stone. You would notice this drift building gradually over the past 2 days, the wind curling around the archway's pillars and dumping its burden of flakes into that particular corner, and now it stood as a smooth, curved barrier that no wheel and no hoof and no foot could cross without first being dug out with shovels, a task no one had yet attempted because there was nowhere to go and no one expected to arrive. The drift was not a wall, but a gentle sculpted shape, its surface marked by the faint ripples left by the wind, and it glittered in the lantern light with 1,000 tiny points of reflection. The inn had become a closed world, and the only news of the world beyond its walls came now as sound. The sound of the inn reached you as you walked the track, not in clear separate noises, but as a blended murmur that seemed to travel through the stone and the thatched snow before it arrived at your ears, losing its sharp edges along the way. The taproom, which had been silent for the first 2 days of the storm, had begun to fill with a low rumble of voices during the late afternoon and evening hours, the innkeeper and his family and the servants gathering there when the day's work was done, and their conversation filtered out through the thick walls as a continuous soft drone. You could not distinguish individual words, only the rise and fall of speech, the occasional lift of a question, the brief pause before an answer, the sudden low burst of a laugh that was quickly swallowed by the snow. The voices had the quality of sound heard through deep water, blurred and distant and strangely comforting. The pewter mugs made their own small contribution to this muffled symphony, a faint, bright clink that cut through the lower frequencies of the voices, the sound of metal on wood as a tankard was set down on a table or lifted from the bar. The clink came at irregular intervals, sometimes 2 or 3 in quick succession, sometimes none at all for the space of an entire circuit, and you found yourself waiting for it without expectation, simply noting its arrival and its absence. The pewter had a particular ring that was different from the duller sound of the wooden cups the servants used, a higher note that carried further, and you could trace the sound back to its source by picturing the taproom in your mind. The long oak table, the settle by the fire, the row of tankards hanging from their hooks above the bar, the innkeeper tilting the jug to refill a mug, the foam sliding down the side in a slow white curtain. The innkeeper's dog contributed his occasional bark, a single, low, percussive note that seemed to come from the kitchen rather than the taproom, followed by a long silence. The bark was not an alarm, but a comment, the dog announcing some small domestic event that required no response, and after it faded, the voices resumed their drone, and the pewter continued its occasional clinking. You heard the scrape of a bench on flagstones once, a long grating sound that was immediately followed by someone's voice rising in brief remonstrance before settling back into the general murmur. And you heard the kitchen door open and close with its familiar low thump, the sound of footsteps crossing the flags, the slosh of water being poured from a bucket into the wash basin, the rattle of the poker among the coals. All of these sounds reached you as if they were happening in another medium entirely, translated from the bright, sharp world of the inn's interior into the muffled, softened world of the snowbound yard. The snow that lay on every surface absorbed and altered the soundscape, and you understood that what you were hearing was not the inn itself, but a version of the inn filtered through 4 inches of white and a solid stone wall, the way the sun appears altered through a pane of oiled paper. The effect was calming, the hush of the snow and the blur of the voices combining to create a sense of comfortable distance, as if you were standing at the edge of a dream in which other people were talking quietly among themselves. The mare's head lowered further as the days passed, and there was a quality to the way she walked, now that you could only describe as trust. She no longer checked your pace or hesitated at the corners. She knew the track as well as you did, perhaps better, and she followed its curve with a slight inward lean, her body angling around the lantern post and the rain barrel and the mounting block with the easy precision of long familiarity. Her ears, which had been so active on the second day with their constant flicking toward the stable and the kitchen and the archway, had settled into a more relaxed posture, turned outward to either side in a way that suggested calm attention rather than alertness. She knew you would not lead her into anything that would hurt her leg, and she had stopped questioning the track and the circle and the endless walking, accepting them as the conditions of her life, for now. This trust was a physical thing you could feel through the halter rope, a softness in the connection between your hand and her head. When you first led her out of the stable on the first day, the rope had been taut with the slight resistance of an animal that did not yet understand what was being asked of her, the pull and release of a negotiation still in progress. Now the rope hung slack between you, the fibers barely kissed by the weight of her head, and when you stopped to rest her leg, she stopped without any signal from the rope at all, simply halting beside you as if she had read the intention in your shoulders. She had learned the routine so completely that she had become part of it, a partner rather than a patient. Her lame leg remained tender, that small heat still present in the center of the swelling, but it was no worse than it had been on the third day, and the stability of the condition was its own kind of progress. You had moved from fearing a worsening to simply watching a slow, gradual mending, and the watchfulness was now habitual rather than anxious, a regular check that you performed every few circuits without any expectation of dramatic change. The mare allowed these examinations with the same placid acceptance, shifting her weight at your touch, but not flinching or pulling away, her dark eye regarding you with what you chose to interpret as patience. The sound of the inn continued its subdued accompaniment as you walked, the voices in the taproom now rising slightly as the evening deepened into night, the clink of pewter becoming more frequent. You heard the innkeeper's wife call something from the kitchen, her voice carrying a short distance before the snow swallowed it, and a boy's voice answered her, high and quick. A door closed somewhere upstairs, a soft thump that traveled down through the walls and emerged into the yard as a faint vibration under your feet. The dog barked once more, and then the kitchen door opened and the dog was let out, his paws crunching across the snow in a brief wandering track that crossed yours at the corner near the rain barrel before he did his business beside the midden heap and hurried back inside, the door closing behind him with its low, definitive thump. The lantern had been lit again, the boy coming out at dusk to swap the candle and strike the spark, and its warm yellow pool fell across the track, and the mare's back and your own moving shape, the shadows rocking gently with your stride. The light from the lantern and the faint glow from the taproom window and the dimmer light from the kitchen formed 3 separate zones of illumination in the yard, 3 soft islands in the general darkness, and you walked through all of them in sequence, passing from one to the next as calmly as a boat crossing a series of quiet coves. The snow continued to fall, and the inn continued to murmur, and the mare continued her slow, trusting walk, her head low and her ears relaxed and her lame leg carrying her around the track with that tiny, familiar nod. The world outside the yard door remained silent and invisible and unreachable, but the world inside the walls was full of small, quiet sounds that kept you company as you walked. The muffled voices and the clinking pewter and the barking dog and the closing doors, all of it heard as if through deep water, all of it as if through deep water, all of it as distant and as comforting as a half-remembered lullaby. The mare's hoofs scuffed on the packed snow, and the track carried you forward, and the inn sounds wrapped around you like a blanket, and the night hours passed in their slow, patient, sound-filled silence. You did not hurry, and you did not tire, and you did not wish for anything other than what you had: the circle, the horse, the soft noise of the inn, and the deep, absorbing quiet of the snow. Late on the 5th night, sometime in the hours that belonged neither to evening nor to morning, but to a deep, suspended stillness between them, the quality of the darkness above the yard began to change. You noticed it first as a faint lightning directly overhead, a thinning of the solid grey that had covered the sky for so many days that you had almost forgotten the sky could be anything else. The change was so subtle that you might have imagined it, a suggestion of texture where before there had been only uniform blankness, and you looked up several times during a single circuit, squinting into the darkness as if your eyes could part the cloud by force of attention. The mare noticed nothing, her head remaining low and her ears relaxed, but you felt a small stirring of something that was not quite anticipation, a quiet alertness that sharpened your senses without disturbing your calm. The snow had been falling with the same fine, dry persistence for most of the 5th day, the flakes so small and so light that they seemed to hang in the air rather than descend, drifting sideways on currents too faint for your face to feel. But now, as you watched the sky between circuits, the flakes began to thin, their numbers decreasing, not abruptly, but in a gradual tapering, the way a rain shower dwindles to a few scattered drops before stopping altogether. The spaces between the flakes grew wider, and the flakes themselves became more sporadic, appearing now as single drifting crystals rather than a continuous curtain, each one finding its own solitary path down through the still air. The hiss that had been the constant background of your walking for 5 days faded into a whisper, and then into an intermittent tick, and then, on a circuit you could not later identify as different from any other, the snowfall itself ceased entirely. The absence of falling snow was a sound in itself, a new kind of quiet that pressed against your ears with a clarity that was almost startling. You could hear the mare's hooves on the track with a crispness that had been muffled before, each footfall distinct and separate. The 3 sound beats and the soft drag now as clean as notes plucked on a string. You could hear your own breathing, the air moving in and out of your lungs with a slight rasp that the snow had hidden. You could hear the inn sign creaking on its bracket, the sound now travelling across the yard without the softening interference of falling flakes, arriving at your ears with a directness that made it seem closer than before. And you could hear, or perhaps you only imagined you could hear, the faint settling of the snowpack itself, the crystals shifting and compacting under their own weight in a continuous, almost subaudible rustle. The clouds began to draw apart overhead, not in a dramatic unveiling, but in a slow, gradual thinning that revealed the darkness behind them as a deeper, cleaner darkness, a black velvet rather than a grey wool. The rents in the cloud layer appeared first as slightly paler streaks, elongated shapes that shifted and reformed as the high winds that you could not feel at ground level moved the cloud masses across the sky. Through these rents the stars began to emerge, one by one, and then, in clusters, sharp points of white light that seemed very close and very far away at the same time. You had not seen stars in nearly a week, and the sight of them now, after so many hours of walking under a featureless grey lid, brought a sense of expansion, as if the yard had suddenly grown larger and the sky had lifted higher, giving you room to breathe. The stars were cold and brilliant, the kind of stars that appear only on the clearest winter nights when the air itself has frozen and all the moisture has dropped out of it as frost. They hung above the yard in their familiar patterns, the great sweep of the winter constellations that you had known since you were a boy, their names rising unbidden in your memory as you walked and looked up. The hunter with his belt of 3 bright stars, the great bear standing on her tail, the cluster of the 7 sisters like a smudge of light at the edge of vision. The lantern on its post seemed dimmer now than it had before, its yellow glow outmatched by the cold white fire of the stars, and its pool of light had contracted to a small humble circle that barely reached the edge of the track. The track itself had changed under the starlight, its surface no longer the soft grey of packed snow, but a darker, harder ribbon that glinted as you walked, the compressed crystals having frozen solid during the hours after the snowfall stopped, transforming into a continuous band of ice-speckled white that reflected the starlight in a million tiny points. Each circuit you walked now took you across a surface that sparkled faintly, the light shifting with your movement, so that the track seemed to flow ahead of you like a river of dim silver. The mare's hooves made a crisper sound on this frozen surface, not the soft shush-shush of the snowbound days, but a sharper crunch, a sound like the breaking of very thin glass, and her right forehoof still left its characteristic drag mark, a dark scar on the glittering band. The cold had intensified with the clearing of the sky, the temperature dropping sharply now that the insulating blanket of cloud had been pulled away. The air felt thin and brittle in your nostrils, each inhalation a sharp blade that cut deep into your chest, and the moisture of your breath froze instantly on the wool of your muffler, building a crust of white frost that crackled when you turned your head. The mare's breath rose in plumes that were thicker and whiter than before, standing out against the black sky like small clouds, and the frost on her coat had thickened into a fine white fur that covered her back and her neck and the tops of her ears, outlining her shape in silver. She did not seem troubled by the cold, her pace remaining steady and her head low, but you could feel through the halter rope that she was moving with a slightly brisker energy, a subtle lift in her step that had not been there during the snowbound days. And it was during one of these circuits, as you passed under the lantern and the starlight and the deep, frozen quiet, that you noticed the mare's right forehoof coming down with a new sureness, the hesitation so reduced that it was barely a hesitation at all, a tiny fractional pause that you might not have noticed if you had not been listening for it through 5 days of walking. The drag was still present, that soft scuff at the end of the stride, but the nod of her head had almost disappeared, and her weight seemed to settle more evenly across all 4 legs as she walked. You stopped her beside the lantern post and felt the leg, kneeling in the frozen track, while the mare stood with uncomplaining patience, and the swelling above the fetlock was now no more than a slight fullness, cool to the touch, the warmth that had marked the injury now entirely gone. The tendon lay flat and smooth under your fingers, the skin sliding easily over it, and when you pressed gently into the hollow above the joint, the mare did not flinch or pull away. She simply stood, her breath clouding the air above your bent head, and waited for you to finish your examination and resume the walking. You straightened up and stood for a moment with your hand resting on her shoulder, looking up at the stars that had emerged from the clouds, and he felt a quiet, private satisfaction that was too calm to be called happiness, but too warm to be called anything else. The mare had healed, or was healing, and the snow had stopped, and the sky had opened, and the long week of walking was drawing toward its natural end. You did not hurry. There was still the rest of the night to walk, and the mare's leg would need careful exercise for days yet to prevent the stiffness from returning. But something had shifted in the texture of the hours, a sense that the work was nearly done. The quiet that followed the stopping of the snow was a different kind of quiet from the one that had accompanied the storm, a stillness that was active rather than passive, alert rather than muffled. You could hear sounds that had been buried for days, the drip of meltwater from the thatch where the warmth of the stable was beginning to work on the snow's underside, the distant call of a fox somewhere far out in the fields, the soft rustle of a night bird settling in the eaves of the inn. And you could hear, when you stopped walking and held your breath, the sound of your own blood moving in your veins, a faint, rhythmic whisper that matched the beating of your heart, a sound so intimate and so constant that you had not heard it since you were a child lying awake in the dark, listening to the secret noises of your own body. The stars wheeled slowly overhead as the night deepened, their positions shifting by increments that you could track against the roofline of the inn, and the track glittered under your feet, and the mare walked beside you with her new, surer step, the faint scuff of her dragging hoof no longer a sound of injury, but a sound of habit, a signature that would fade with time. You walked on through the frozen stillness, and the night opened above you, and the world that had been closed for so long began very slowly to open with it. The 6th morning arrived as a slow brightening along the eastern rim of the sky, a pale band of lemon-colored light that crept upward from behind the stable roof and diluted the deep black of the night into a softer, gentler grey. The stars that had burned so sharply overhead during the frozen hours after the snow stopped had faded one by one, the faintest first and then the brighter ones, until only the morning star remained, hanging low above the garden wall like a single steady candle in an empty room. The cold had not lessened with the approach of dawn. the air still brittle and sharp and utterly still, and every surface in the yard wore a thick fur of frost that sparkled in the growing light with the delicacy of crushed glass. The track you had walked for so many days lay frozen and hard underfoot, a ribbon of compacted ice-speckled snow that had been polished by your passing into a dull grey-white gleam, and your shoes made a crisp, clean sound on it with each step, no longer the soft shush of the snowbound hours, but a distinct crunch that seemed very loud in the profound quiet. The mare had walked beside you through the last of the night with that new soreness in her stride, the hesitation in her right foreleg, now so slight that it registered only as a tiny catch in the rhythm, a breath-sized pause that you felt through the halter rope rather than saw. Her head no longer nodded with each step, and her weight settled evenly across all 4 feet when you stopped to rest her leg, the swelling above the fetlock having diminished to nothing more than a faint fullness that was cool to the touch, the skin smooth and loose over the tendon. She had healed, not completely but sufficiently, the strained fibers knitting themselves back together over the long, patient hours of circling, and now she moved with the quiet ease of a horse whose body no longer pained her. You had checked the leg once more in the deep hour before dawn, kneeling in the frozen track while she stood with her breath pluming around your head, and you had felt only the normal contours of a sound leg, the hard, clean line of the cannon bone and the elastic give of healthy tissue, and you had allowed yourself a small, private certainty that the work was done. The horn sounded as you were turning the corner by the archway, a single long note that came from somewhere far up the Great North Road, so faint at first that it might have been a trick of the wind or a sound imagined out of silence. You stopped walking, and the mare stopped beside you without any signal from the rope, her head lifting for the first time in days, her ears pricking forward and turning together toward the archway like 2 small radar dishes seeking a signal. The horn sounded again, this time clearer and slightly longer, a 2-note call that rose and then fell, the classic signal of a coaching horn blown by a guard to announce approach, and you understood that the road had opened, that somewhere beyond the drifted archway a coach was laboring through the snow toward the inn, breaking the week-long silence with its brass voice. You stood perfectly still in the track, the halter ropes slack in your hand, and you listened to the horn's echo die away across the white fields, the note thinning and stretching until it was indistinguishable from the morning air. The mare's ears remained pricked forward, her whole body alert in a way it had not been for days, her neck arched slightly and her nostrils flaring as she sorted the scents that the cold air carried. She had heard coaching horns before many times, and the sound meant arrivals and departures and the bustle of the road, all the things that had been absent during the deep snow week. She did not pull or fidget. She simply stood with her ears reaching toward the sound, her lame leg bearing its share of her weight without complaint. And you let her stand, because the standing was itself a measure of how far she had come. The horn fell silent, and in the quiet that followed you heard the inn begin to stir. The kitchen door opened with its familiar low thump, and the innkeeper's voice called something into the yard, a short command that was answered by a boy's higher tone. Then came the scrape of a shovel on stone, a harsh, grating sound that shattered the frozen stillness, followed by another shovel, and then a third, the rhythmic cuff, chuff, chuff of blades cutting into the drift that had sealed the archway. The inn was digging itself out, preparing for the coach that was somewhere out there on the white road, laboring toward warmth and fresh horses, and you knew that your long, solitary week of walking was drawing to its close. You did not move from the center of the track. The mare stood beside you, her head still lifted and her ears swiveling now between the distant horn and the nearer sounds of the shovels and the voices that had begun to multiply around the stable block, and you let the moment hold you in its quiet suspension, the last stillness before the world returned. The pink gold light of the winter sunrise had begun to wash across the yard, catching the frost on the thatch and turning it to a field of tiny orange sparks, and the icicles on the stable eaves glowed with an internal light that seemed to come from within the ice itself, a cold fire that burned without heat. The track you had worn into the snow lay revealed in the full daylight for the first time, a continuous dark oval pressed deep into the white blanket, its surface glazed and hardened by the freeze, and you could see every step of the thousands of circuits you had walked, the overlapping impressions of your shoes and the mare's hooves and the distinctive drag mark of the lame right foreleg, all written into the snow like a long, patient letter. The shovels continued their work at the archway, the blades biting into the drift with a steady, purposeful rhythm, and you heard the innkeeper's voice again, this time closer, calling something about the stable and the horses and the coach that would need a fresh team. The stable door was pushed wide, and the grey gelding and the bay horse were led out into the yard by a groom you did not know, a young man with straw in his hair who had presumably been roused from a warm corner to help with the sudden work of preparation. The gelding stamped and snorted, his breath clouding the air, and the bay horse shook his head until the halter buckles jingled, and the yard, which had been so silent for so long, was suddenly full of noise and movement. The contained energy of the inn breaking loose after a week of enforced stillness. You remained where you were, standing in the center of the oval track with the mare beside you, and you watched the activity with the detached calm of a man who had been awake for 6 days and 6 nights, whose body had become a mechanism of slow walking and who needed a long moment to adjust to the return of ordinary time. The mare shifted her weight from one hind foot to the other, a small movement of restlessness, and you laid your hand on her neck, feeling the solid warmth of her under the frost-stiffened coat. And she settled again, her ears flicking once before relaxing. The innkeeper came out of the kitchen and crossed the yard toward you, his boots leaving deep, clean prints in the snow that lay outside the track. He was a broad, solid man, with a heavy coat thrown over his shoulders and no hat on his head, his grey hair standing up in tufts where he had just risen from sleep. And he carried a wooden bucket of warm water in one hand, the steam rising from it in thick curls. He stopped at the edge of the track and looked at the mare, his eyes moving from her head to her feet and back again, and then he looked at you, and he nodded once, a short, economical gesture that contained everything that needed to be said. You nodded back, and that was all the conversation the moment required. He set the bucket down on the mounting block and walked over to inspect the mare's leg, bending with a grunt to run his broad, capable hand down the length of the foreleg from the knee to the coronet, his fingers probing the hollows and the tendons with the automatic skill of a man who had kept horses for 30 years. The mare stood quietly under his examination, her weight balanced and her head low, and when he straightened up he said nothing but gave you a second nod, this one slower and more deliberate, a nod that acknowledged the work you had done and the time you had spent and the quiet patience of the long walking. You received the nod without speaking, and he turned away to supervise the shoveling and the preparation of the fresh team, his voice rising in a series of calm commands that sent the stable boy running and the young groom hurrying toward the harness room. The shovels had broken through the drift now, and the archway gaped open to the road beyond, a rough passage cut through the white barrier with walls of packed snow on either side, and through this passage you could see the Great North Road stretching away to the south, a long white ribbon marked by a single dark line where the coach had already passed, its wheels cutting through the fresh powder to the frozen ruts beneath. The coach itself was not yet visible, but you could hear its distant labor, the faint creak of the wheels and the heavier thud of the horses' hooves and the jingle of the harness, sounds that grew slowly louder as the vehicle approached, rising like a tide. The mare's ears turned toward the sound, and she lifted her head again, her nostrils working. You reached up and unbuckled the halter, sliding the noseband down over her muzzle and pulling the crown piece over her ears, and she stood free for the first time in 6 days, her head rising and her neck stretching as she looked around the yard with a mild curiosity, as if seeing it anew. The halter was stiff with cold and heavy with frozen moisture, and you coiled the rope around your hand in a slow, deliberate loop, a small ritual of ending. The mare did not wander. She stood beside you in the track, her shoulder brushing your arm, and you let her stand, knowing that she would be led back to her stall soon enough, knowing that her leg would need careful watching for days yet, but that the worst was over. The long crisis of the snowbound week resolved into a quiet, steady healing. The coach horn sounded again, much closer now, a bright, brassy fanfare that echoed off the inn walls, and brought the innkeeper's wife to the kitchen door with a cloth in her hands, and a look of alert expectancy on her face. The young groom, who had been clearing the archway, stepped aside, wiping his forehead with his sleeve, and the first coach of the new world, the first wheeled thing to move on the Great North Road in a week, rumbled through the passage and into the yard, its horses steaming and its passengers peering out of the windows with the dazed expressions of people who had been traveling through a white wilderness and had finally arrived at shelter. You watched the coach pull up beside the mounting block, the driver calling something down to the innkeeper, the passengers beginning to stir inside, and then you turned away, stepping out of the track for the last time and walking toward the stable with the coiled halter in your hand and the mare following behind you without any need for a lead. Her right forehoof still made that tiny, almost imperceptible drag on the snow, a sound you would carry in your memory for a long time, a sound that had become the rhythm of your waking and the pulse of your walking and the quiet heartbeat of the snowbound week. You led her into the stable and put her in her stall, and she turned around once and then settled into the straw with a deep, shuddering sigh, her bad leg eased and her eyes already half closing. You latched the stall door and stood for a moment with your hand on the top rail, looking at her. Then you walked back out into the yard. The inn was bustling now, the passengers disembarking and the horses being changed and the innkeeper's wife calling for hot water and fresh bread, but you walked through the noise without hearing it, your feet carrying you by long habit along the curve of the track, following its oval path one final time until you reached the center of the yard, the point near the lantern post where the circuit had always come back to itself. You stopped there, in the precise middle of the ring you had worn into the snow, and you stood very still, feeling the cold air move into your lungs and out again, feeling the deep quiet that still lived beneath the surface of the yard's new noise like a pool of still water under a thin layer of ice. The track stretched around you in its perfect, patient loop, a dark line on the white ground that contained 6 days and 6 nights of slow walking, of snow falling and snow stopping, of lantern light and starlight, and the soft scuff of a lame hoof, of warm broth and cold fingers and the quiet company of a chestnut mare who had trusted you to lead her in circles until her leg was sound. You took one last slow breath of the cold, clean air, holding it in your chest for a long moment, and then you let it go, watching it curl upward in a white plume that caught the morning sunlight and then dissolved into nothing. The coach driver cracked his whip somewhere behind you. The passengers laughed at something. The kitchen door banged shut, and the world that had been so quiet for so long resumed its ordinary noise. But for that one long suspended moment you stood in the center of your circle and listened to the silence that remained underneath everything. A silence you would carry with you long after the snow had melted and the road had dried and the mare's leg had healed completely. A silence that belonged to the snowbound week and to the gentle, endless walkid, and the tchantsquap